Settlement of the West. You might have already read about overland trails. Why didn't more people take trains out west? The shift to trains is gradual. At first, those transcontinental railroads are very expensive. So some people do opt to have their supplies brought out west or opt to travel themselves via train and then have the supplies brought by coach, carriage, or wagon. It won't be till the end of the century till the vast majority of Americans, when they travel out west, do so exclusively by rail. When we talk about settlement of the West, we're talking about the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, the Great Basin, that stuff in between California and, say, Missouri. And it's not all just Easterners heading west. It's some people from Mexico heading north. It's even some people from Asia heading east. And if we look at the total of federal land out west, in 1860 there was approximately 1 billion acres of federal land, and about half of that is given away by 1900. Now, among those 500 million acres that the federal land distributed, about half of that land was sold to the states. So when a territory becomes a state, oftentimes they purchase some of, not all, but some of the federal land within their borders. About a quarter of it was given to railroad companies, and that's not a large number of railroad companies. That's a select few large, powerful railroad companies. Another 19% or almost 20% was sold to speculators. These are corporations or individuals who intended to turn around and sell that land for a profit. Only about 9%. So only about 1 out of every 11 acres in the United States was sold via the Homestead Act. And this is land going to farmers and families. This is land for economic opportunity. Only a small portion of Western federal lands ends up being distributed under the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act sold land to settlers or homesteaders for a very, very small fee. The deal was you had to pledge to live on that land and farm it for at least 5 years. This is especially popular with European immigrants because for them, the idea of land being available for purchase that they could afford was completely amazing to them. Remember, in Europe, unless you came from royal or noble bloodlines, your family hadn't owned land for years. Over the course of the life of the Homestead Act, from 1862 up to 1890, over 500,000 families moved west on Homestead Act purchases. Now, it was not a great life for those homesteaders. Most people who signed up or purchased land under the Homestead Act did not have enough cash to buy the land, to pay for moving expenses, to purchase equipment like steel plows and water pumps, and support themselves until their farm became self-sufficient. The soil on the Great Plains, today we think of it as the breadbasket of America, but that's a result of heavy fertilization and irrigation. Remember, this is grassland. The soil out there, not as good as back east. Not as good as this great Midwestern soil we have here in Ohio or even in Pennsylvania or New York. The plots of land that people purchased were too big for your average farmer to afford to be able to irrigate that land sufficiently. But they're too little land to use dry farming techniques and still make money. The federal government, to its credit, attempted to help out homesteaders through various additional acts. The Timber Culture Act of 1873 allowed homesteaders to double the size of their farm. You could buy twice as much federal land if you agreed to plant some trees. Trees are important. They help with preserving topsoil, and they also help preventing strong winds from blowing away topsoil and nutrients. The Timber Culture Act is a big step forward in making those Homestead Act farms workable. The Desert Land Act was an extension of the Homestead Act. It allowed cheap, really dry land out west, land that had not been considered for Homestead Act sales because it was just too dry. It allowed that kind of land to be sold if people promised to irrigate it. There was a lot of fraud involved with this, but it did end up getting a lot of that federal land purchased. Now, because of that fraud, a lot of it ends up in the hands of land speculation companies. The Timber and Stone Act did the same thing, but for cheap forest land or like rocky mountainous land that might be good for mining. But land that was not suitable for farming could be purchased by individuals. Again, fraud leads to a lot of that land ending up in the hands of wealthy corporations. The most important, though, was probably the National Reclamation Act, which doesn't come till 1902. Water had quickly become the most valuable resource out west, and as a result, speculation on water was driving up the price of any land that might have access to easy water systems. Irrigation systems are going to be needed throughout the West if Western lands are going to be productive agriculturally. That is not fully achieved until we get the National Reclamation Act passed in 1902, which stated that the sale of all federal lands from that point forward, after 1902, the money from those sales will go to finance irrigation systems. This is going to make for better farming out west, but it's also going to just intensify that growing demand for water. Let's talk briefly about the railroad companies, as they were the largest Western land owners. That was a direct result of the policy that was followed for giving railroad companies land. The federal government wanted to encourage economic growth out west, and they reasoned, probably rightly so, that railroads would be essential to such economic growth. To make sure railroads got built, they made it very easy on the railroad companies. One, they gave them large chunks of land, 20 miles to the north and 20 miles to the south in alternating patterns like we see here. The reason being was that they wanted the railroad companies to be able to bend and curve and turn the track to get around any natural obstacles, and to make the construction as easy and as quick as possible. They also gave the railroad companies really low interest loans for every mile of track that they built. The railroad companies were supposed to turn around and supposed to return the land that they ended up not using, but they never did that. The railroad companies held on to it. Nobody came in and told them to sell it back or give it back to the United States. So the railroad companies have lots and lots of land after they build the track, lots and lots of land that they can sell. And they do. In fact, every large railroad company have their own land department. They have a whole separate part of their business that prices land, that handles credit for people trying to purchase land. They even taught farming courses to people so that if somebody said, well, I couldn't buy Western land, I wouldn't know the first thing about farming. The railroad companies were ready for that answer by saying, we'll teach you how to be a farmer. The railroad companies also focused on immigrants. They had bureaus of immigration that recruited immigrants in Europe. They traveled to European countries and recruited people to buy land and move to America. They also met immigrants directly on the docks back east in New York or Baltimore or Boston or Philly. They even had reserved train cars. So as soon as somebody stepped off of the boat from Europe and they signed the papers purchasing land out west, they hopped on a private train car with other newfound homesteaders, newfound farmers, traveled out west to their plot of land and started their new life. If we look at all of this Western land distribution, and we look at the intent of those land policies, if we look at the intent as merely to make those Western lands economically productive, we could say this was a success. But if we look at the intent as being to increase democracy and equality and opportunities for all Americans, then we could be a little bit more critical of the policies followed at this time, because the majority of that land went to railroad companies and speculators, not to individual Americans. Only 1 out of every 9 acres of land ended up in the hands of pioneers, and 2 out of every 3 of those pioneering families failed. It was unsuccessful to try to farm out west for most people who tried, and they ended up giving up and moving back east.